You guys ready to go? You guys good? All right. Cool. Well, everybody, welcome to the second speaker series. I'm Travis Ganong. I was a member of the U.S. ski team for the last 18 years. I raced almost 200 World Cups, had a bunch of podiums, had an amazing career, and obviously all those years on the road, I learned a lot about skis, boots, equipment, setup, and so tonight's talk, we're going to really focus on ski boots. I'm here with Jim Schaffner, who's a longtime legend in the boot fitting world, and he's actually developed boots for K2, right? You developed the boot for K2. You worked for Solomon for a long time. And when I was home here in Tahoe, this was kind of my go-to guy to help me get my boots dialed in for the season. So I would often be in here in June and July when it was super warm, dialing in the boots and kind of working with the setup. And I guess the main takeaway from my whole career was that boots are by far the most important part of the setup for skiing. And I'm not talking about just ski racing, but just anything, going out on the hill and having a good time. If something's off with the fit or the canting or the base, like if it's not flat, like if something's a little bit off with the boot, it'll affect the rest of your skiing performance. That connection, once your boot is super dialed in, that connection between your foot and the ski and the edge is second nature. It's almost like an extension of your body. But if one little tiny thing is wrong with the setup, oftentimes you're just confused about what's going on. I can't make a turn. Something's off. What's going on? So when I would start the season in the spring, my first camp of the year, I would start with 10 pairs of boots. I would start with a big chunk of boots, and for some reason one boot would fit better than another boot, and we would kind of start from the raw shell of the boot and every day kind of grind a little bit more, change a little bit more to make it fit well. The fit was kind of the first goal of the boot, trying to make the boot kind of comfortable so I could be out there all day and not be in pain. Because ski boots are pretty small. So I mean, for example, my shoe size is 10.5, and I'm in a size 7.5 boot if it was going to be a shoe. So that's how many sizes down I would go. And the reason I would do that is strictly for performance. Obviously, it's not a comfort thing. It's not like I'm doing that because it's what feels the best. But when I'm going 90 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour, racing downhill, the precision I needed with that connection to my skis, to the tip of my ski through my boot, was so important that I tried to get the smallest volume I could. And so it's really similar to I like the analogy of like a Formula One car versus like a school bus. A Formula One car is like minimal, it's compact, it's kind of efficient and low to the ground, and when you tap on the steering wheel, the Formula One car hooks up immediately. Same thing with a downside ski boot for me. That was my personal preference. When I would be in this boot, super low volume, my big toe would be resting right on the front of the boot. I could feel it. And right when I wanted the ski to engage and go, I could just tap my big toe and it would go. And every once in a while, if I have a boot that didn't fit perfectly or that was a little bit loose, I would kind of try to get that tip of the ski to engage through the big toe, and there'd be a fraction of a second of like the timing wasn't there and it wouldn't hook up and things wouldn't work out. So when I was looking to find that perfect race boot, this is actually my downhill race boot from the last few seasons. This boot's 2 years old, but I started out with three to four pairs of boots identical to this, and each day we were training in the summer, we would kind of come back and grind a little bit more here, maybe get a little bigger heel pocket, kind of fine tune it until it was that perfect fit, and then once the boot was dialed, kind of put it aside and save it for racing, and then work on the next one. But it's just, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to kind of spend the time to look at your boots and figure out your setup. And yeah, if something's off with your boots, it can be really tough to ski. So
I'm going to add an anecdotal story.
Yes.
So the season before this last one, Travis had contacted me, I think in between South American trips, and he was struggling a bit with his boots. And what had happened, I think, at Atomic is, one, they'd come up with some more new models, and two, the way he was getting service was like a day here and a day there. He wasn't going like back into the factory and getting like soup to nuts every boot done the same way. And so that work he's talking about that they were doing was kind of on their own on the road. So the guys travel actually with a kit that's got Fordham's in it, and they have the ability to do some heat stretching. But he phoned me up, and it was like a personal request in the sense of, yeah, we're working on boots, but the story behind it was that at the time, I think you guys thought that Mitch was going to keep going maybe to the next Olympics. And one of the things that Travis said to me was that if she's going for 4 years, I'm going to go for 4 years. And if I'm going to go for 4 years, I can't do it in these boots I have because I've got like half a dozen pair of boots and everyone is different. They all feel different. And so he brought his bags in and we just laid everything out and went to ground zero. And it was for the purpose, and this is important to just say out loud, that it was about the fit. It was about getting him, because he was talking to me about saying how during the course of the previous season, he was getting to the point where he wasn't going out and skiing. So, which, if you guys know Travis is a skier. He's not a guy who's just there to be a ski racer, show up at the start, make a run, go into the lodge. He likes to ski, and what he was finding was that when he's in pain, it would keep him from actually training. And so that really emphasizes that point that he was trying to make about the importance of it being holistic and being comfortable. And too many times we sacrifice that with the athletes, and they don't even know that it's affecting them. You know, they don't realize they're not taking that last run sometimes, and they've narrowed things down, or they're spending more time in the lodge massaging their feet than they are on the hill. And so, you know, when we're talking about athletes of all ages, that has to be the primary objective, is first to get, you know, ultimate comfort, but comfort that delivers the performance. So
yeah, no, it's a fine balance between like performance and comfort, because like a lot of racers, we all like to have a little bit tighter, smaller boot than what we should. Like normally I would never fit into the boot this size, but once we were done punching out the heel, grinding out a big heel pocket, working on the toe, pushing a little bit, grinding a little bit here and there, I actually got to the point where I upsized my liner. So this liner is actually for the next size boot. And I just found that worked for me. And it was really tough from time to time. Like to Jim's point, that one summer in Chile, I had boots fit by 3 different atomic boot fitters, and the consistency was all over the map. There was a little chunk here and here and here, and we'd have very limited time to like really kind of smooth everything out and get it dialed. And so coming back home to Jim, we kind of opened up every boot, we looked at where everything was, and we kind of made it fit better. And like this is one of the pairs of boots that you dialed in that day, yeah, which turned into my race boot for the last 2 seasons and obviously worked really well. Yeah, so thank you for that.
All right. So did I say something I shouldn't have said about you when you were going to quit, or when you were going to?
Oh no, nothing.
Okay.
Nothing.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many different things that you can do to change how a boot works. Do you want to talk a little bit about like boot boards and footbeds and canting, and do you want to get into the nuts and bolts?
Well, I would say, why don't you show kind of what your story is? Like, why don't you pop your boot boards out and explain how you got to where you're at, and also, you know, when and how you make changes when you're, you know, working on things like forward lean, ramp angle, flex, and cuff alignment, sole alignment.
Yeah. So, like I was saying earlier, there's a million different things you can do to change how a boot works, and there's different plastics, there's different stiffnesses of plastics, there's different cuffs, there's different angles for your boot board. You can have a heel that's slightly up, a heel that's slightly down, and that'll change how you engage the ski. You can have different booster straps. You can change where your buckles are. I actually had them re-drill all of my buckles down further on the shell, so I could, and then this one further this way, so I could get it even tighter. I mean, I would crank these down even tighter for races, and where the stock buckles were put was not enough. And for me, like this took years and years and years to figure out what works. Like I started out with just a stock boot, and over time learned what was fast, what was slow. I learned from my teammates. I learned from the boot guys. I learned from different people. Every athlete has something quite different with what they
Can you explain like these numbers that are on your boot board? And
so the boot board, I'll never forget a story about, well, I don't know if I want to talk stories, but Darren Rawls back in the day, I remember a story from Darren, and Phil, you might know about this a bit, but his boot board apparently was super low, and he liked bringing it super low. So mine right now is set at 12 in the front and 22 in the back, and that's millimeters. Yeah. So 12.
And basically every World Cup boot you stick your nose into will have those two numbers on it. And if the boot wasn't there and I said, Travis, what's
1222?
Right, you just go 1222. It's like,
Yeah.
get tattooed in your arm, because that's, but the other thing is that he learned that over time period, that's his home base, that's his sweet spot.
Yeah.
How often have you tested that since you discovered it?
Not often. I mean, not that much. One year I did try to, so from back to the Darren story, apparently he was like 10, 20, or like he would bring it all down a little bit, which would help him glide. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but him being a little bit lower in the boot would help him kind of release the ski and be like a little bit more sneaky with his riding like a flat ski, which who knows, but yeah, once I found that number, that was one part of the equation that I just kind of like, all right, this is what I need. I'm gonna put it aside and not think about it anymore. And that's kind of a common thing I'm gonna talk about. Like you could go every day, you could change this, change that, do this, and you're left not knowing anything. You're left kind of in the weeds, not really knowing what works and what doesn't work. And at the end of the day, good solid skiing is gonna overcome all these little tiny minute things.
In a perfect world, if you could, you'd want every athlete to be able to go through that process, but it's not always possible, and there's a psychology of how you're skiing as to how often you make changes or attempt to do things differently. A lot of times you can kind of get in a dark place in your mental approach to the sport, and the next thing you know, you're trying to make changes in your equipment versus making changes up here. And at the same time, it's worth giving voice to the fact that there's certain athletes that are capable of holding all that stuff inside of them. There's athletes that will have a dozen boot boards, and you can watch them on a training day switch every run, and every run's videoed, every run is timed, and every run has the athletes and the coaches' feedback, and they try and get to that point. But then there's certain athletes that don't change that. I'm going to go into like another generation, but the Mares had a guy that traveled with him, and he kept in his pocket the white Teflon AFD pads, and those are about 0.5 millimeter thick, and he always had them in his coat on a hill. And at a certain race that they were warming up, and one of the twins didn't like the way things were feeling on the snow, their guy Alan would be slipping these steels either into heel height, into the toe, and sometimes just down the sides of the boot above the ankle bones. And so those guys were constantly trying to find the feel on the snow condition and the track they were at. But I would say the most logical deal, which Travis I think has always approached his stuff very logically, is to know your numbers and trust your numbers until you don't, and then then you try.
And the trust is another big part of it too. Like sometimes I would get a boot board from the factory, and it would have a 1222 on it, and when we would measure it, and it would not be that. And so that's another thing. Like even when you get stuff from the factory, they sometimes make mistakes. And also the other thing, like sometimes you get a boot board out and it's not flat. It doesn't sit flat. And so then that's obviously going to change how you sit in the boot as well.
And one other thing about receiving product, and I think that's another problem when Travis wasn't going to the factory and receiving, and they were just shipping. The factories all think that there is like a common ground for all athletes. And so if there's a setup of the boot, that's how Travis, when I say a setup, it's the factory's view of maybe what's working for this athlete, and they, in their minds, say, okay, well, that should be good for everybody then. Travis, don't complain. Just take the boots and go ski in them because so-and-so's, on the podium and so-and-so's on the podium. But the bottom line is, it's just because they've decided that globally, that all athletes should start here. Most athletes don't end there. They know that that's what they're going to get from the factory, and then they start to make adjustments as they need them, which has been the case with you, that the factory setup typically isn't. And I also know, I think at one point we talked about this, but I'm not sure they ever, each factory keeps a fitting sheet on all their athletes as well, but I think the one they were using at Atomic was based off of those original bi-material injected boots, not current ones. So I think when they were setting these up, they were using like grinds and punches from a different boot to set him up, and that was kind of another recipe for him having to go behind them with a Fordham and
do a lot more work.
Grind them into shape.
It actually got to the point at the end where I was just asking for raw boots that weren't
they had nothing
pre-ground or anything, and then we could come here and really dial it in. They actually, Atomic has a mold of my foot that they made. They did like a casted mold of my foot that they used over the years to kind of try to fit the boot with me not there, because I obviously live in North America, so it's hard for me to get to the factory. But I think that's not a great solution.
No.
In the grand scheme of things, like working with Jim, you would always put like black lipstick all over my foot, and like actually put my foot in the raw boot, and like the black lipstick would kind of stick all around the shell, and he could find exactly what needed to be ground and where we could smooth things out and what. So we didn't actually. The other thing is, if you take away too much material, all of a sudden you're swimming around, and again, it comes back to the Ferrari or the Formula One car versus a bus. Like, you just don't have that same engagement with the ski, and that adds up exponentially in a downhill race. Yeah, I mean, and then on the bottom of the boots, I'm not sure. Do a lot of boots that people get come with information on them?
Yeah, usually they'll have some indicator.
Yeah.
So like yours is an HI.
That's CTI. So so this is kind of the model in the plastic, HI CTI, and then I would always set up. Let's talk about canting a little bit, because that's something that's obviously pretty important. I mean, that for me, for most racers, how your boot is canted is more or less after the fit. I would say the canting is more or less the most important part for how you engage your ski and how you can release the ski and how you can generate speed, how you can go fast. So canting, for people who don't know, it's how the boot is set up when it's attached to the binding, the angle of the bottom and the angle of the cuff. And so the boot has the ability, you have the ability in the boot to change the canting either by grinding the bottom or changing the cuff angle. And so for me and for most downhillers, we always set the bottom at 0, dead flat 0. And so they use a laser level from the back of the boot, and they make sure that it's dead set level based on like the bottom is level and this is level 90 degrees, that's 0. And then after that, I always set my boot 0.5 degrees out, and that would allow me, when I rolled the ski over, to, correct me if I'm wrong, to engage the ski earlier.
Yep.
Yeah, to be a little bit more.
You've shown the marks that are on your boot so that you can tell from a distance.
Yeah.
Whether it's in the right spot. And he's got some marks on the cuff, and then this little white line on the cuff screw. Tells him that he's where he wants to be on both sides.
Exactly. So, and that's something that one of the only things I would ever adjust and change depending on conditions. I remember like guys like Didier Couche, they were super famous for always kind of changing this. If it's really icy, they would make their boot a tiny bit more aggressive. If it's really soft, they would bring it to be less aggressive. So they'd bring it back to 0 or something. And so that's just kind of how aggressive if the boot's too aggressive, when you hit on the edge, sometimes it'll launch you into a gate and your timing will be off. If it's not aggressive enough and it's icy and you try to push on the ski, you might miss the timing and get pushed low and lose time as well. So that's something that you kind of adjust to conditions. Most of the time I would never touch it. Most of the time I would just leave it how it was and just kind of focus on my skiing and adjust other things. but that's definitely a way you can change your setup is the canting. And I guess the main point I want to make with the canting is to make sure the boot's flat. So when you put it on a flat surface, making sure it doesn't kind of wobble. I don't know if this one,
it's got a
little wobble on that one. I mean, these ones are just like locked in. They're dead set locked in. And then making sure, do most boot fitting shops like do laser leveling to make sure everything's all.
Yeah, I mean, again, we don't use laser. We just use a protractor.
Yeah, protractor. So that's the other thing, is just making sure that the boot is what it says it is. Like sometimes we've gotten boots that say they're 0.5, 0 on the bottom, 0.5 on the cuff out, and you get them and it's like 1 degree in on the cuff, or like this one's the other way. Like they're just all over the map. And so when you go out and ski, for some reason you're going edge to edge, pushing on the ski, and like one turn's good, then you lose your ski, then you're falling inside, like it's not hooking up, like it's all over the map. So consistency, I think, is the main point, like making sure the canting and the boot's flat and everything's kind of lined in like that. That's the main point. And you can also you can go way down the rabbit hole, like changing canting and this and that, but once you find what works for you and keep it consistent, then you can, again, like the boot board, it's good and you put it to the side and that's your boot's ready. That's kind of how I like to look at it. There's a lot of athletes, teammates and other athletes that are constantly fiddling with their boots and changing the canting and changing the boot boards and changing this and that, and that can be really difficult a really difficult place to race because you're always kind of unsure of how the boot's going to react, and you're always a little bit cautious when you push on the ski. You're not really sure what's going to happen. So what I like to do, I have a good story. When I won in Garmisch in 2017, that winter or that spring, we were testing in RA, Sweden. I think the world champs were coming up after that, and so we went up there to test and do a spring camp, and I had access that year to the full Atomic factory service. So they sent up 2 boot fitting guys, and I tried every single boot that Atomic makes. They have 7 different models, and then within those 7 different models, they have 3 different cuffs, and within all of those, they have 3 different stiffnesses. And then there's all sorts of other spoilers and carbon shims and this and that. Like, it's just, when you add up all of those things, the amount of different setups, or it's too much. It's way too much. But that year I was like, okay, I had a really good season, like, but maybe there's one thing I'm missing. Like, let's just go on a deep dive with boots and try every single boot that they make. And so I went up there and I tested every boot, and there's not enough time in the day, more or less, to test everything. But I tried, and I got to the point where I was like, well, pretty much everything kind of works. So I went through the whole summer with all these different boots that kind of worked, and I was still unsure of what was going to be my race setup, because on a race day you can only have one boot, right? So I got to that winter season and I still had like 3 or 4 different models that were like really good. And in the summer time, you're training on soft snow. I was always pretty fast in the summer training, so like everything was going good. Everything was really good, but everything was working. And then I got to the races, and the night before the race, I was like, do I use this boot or do I use this boot? It was just something in my head. I was like, why am I still thinking about this? Like, this is not what I should be thinking about. I should be thinking about my skiing and the course and the conditions and where I want to push, where I want to hold back, tactics. And I was thinking about, like, I had to choose a boot. Moral of the story is I definitely regretted that decision, and it took me half of that season to figure out my race setup still, because I had so many different options. And then after that season, I never tested again. I was like, this is my downhill boot, this is my Super G boot, I'm focusing on skiing, that's it. And that was, I went through the whole journey, and I made a mistake, I think, with going too deep into it, but that's what I learned.
And I think part of that story, though, rings true whether you're talking about an 8-year-old or you're talking about a 30-year-old, that you have this task in the off season or during the training period to get your stuff dialed in. And this may be a bit of a stretch, but if you imagine that everything else, if it's identical, World Cup ski racing and NASCAR racing have a similarity. And the similarities are is that there's height limitations on what you can do with the boot. There's height limitations with the ski. There's rules about length and about side cut. Just like on a track for a car, there's rules about weight. There's rules about horsepower. There's rules about how you can set up the suspension and the distance between where the car ends and where the road begins. And if you follow those rules within all of that, and everybody gets their stuff dialed in appropriately, who's the first guy to the finish?
The best one.
The guy who's got it figured out. Yeah. The guy who either has the line or the tactics or the technique that on that track for that day. But the idea is you don't want to be walking around in your bags, ski bags, boot bags, with stuff that doesn't work and that doesn't bring you down the hill. So the idea here is that all athletes at all ages, even if they're young kids, need to be well set up, fit properly. So the difference between who scores where is the difference between figuring out what your coach is telling you, what you're working on in training, and if the coach says, okay, there's this section here that there's this really critical turn when you come off the steep into the flat. If you chum this turn, there's absolutely no way you're going to make it fast to the finish line. You're going to be crawling to the finish line. And if Johnny or Susie gets to that point, doesn't heed the training advice, doesn't heed the advice of the coach, and they make that mistake, it's not because they're in the wrong size boot, the wrong flex boot, dad didn't nail the wax, or whoever's helping you out with your ski prep. But ultimately, like Travis has a guy that's working on his skis for him, so does every other member of the U.S. ski team and every member of the Austrian ski team. And yes, those guys are trying to do their best to come up with the best mixes for that day or the best base for that day. But the point is that in the end, you get all of this stuff leveled out so that all you have to do is get in the starting gate and think about execution, where you're supposed to be when, and what kind of energy you're going to bring to the course. You know, are you going to be aggressive the whole way? Are you going to, you know, in this section, are you going to back her down? Are you going to swing wide? Are you going to, you know, swing wide at the first gate in a slalom or a GS to set up your rhythm? Those are all decisions that the athlete makes, not the boot or the ski.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so many variables in ski racing that are out of your control, but boots are something that you're kind of in your control. If you spend the time to look at your boots and talk to people like Jim who have tons of experience and figure out exactly what you're using and what the bevels are, how it's all set up, then like you said, you can forget about it and focus on the skiing part, which is the goal. So
can I ask a question? Did you ever try canting differently on one side compared to the other, based on like the way your body's built, I guess?
I mean, so if you look at these boots right here, there's these lines right in the middle, and so I actually, I went to this. I'll tell the story. I went to this place in Austria that makes these custom liners. It's kind of in northeastern Austria, and you make a foam liner. They take all the foam out, and then they rebuild it with this kind of harder material, so it'll last longer, and it'll. I don't know. I really enjoyed liners. Is a whole other topic. We can talk about that next, but. More or less, when they were making sure how everything was lined up, they got me in the boot and they checked my canting again while in the boot with this as the center line. And I never wanted to try something different. I was always even with the way I stood in my boot, I guess is the answer. I wasn't I mean, I am bow-legged a little bit, but everything kind of lines up symmetrically from one side to the next.
Does your guy have a different setup on your boots?
I had, because I broke my left leg, so for me, we kind of played around with that, especially on the speed side. So that's why I was wondering if you've had athletes that you've had to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if Travis, which by the way he doesn't, it's interesting to explain this, but nothing gets done just singly by itself. So he doesn't come in with his boots and we do all this stuff and we don't then go through and recheck canting on every single one. They all get remeasured. And so if there's, if 10 out of 10 times Travis is lining up with his right leg, strong to the outside, as a boot guy, I might not just automatically go, Travis, I'm going to just change this for you, but I might send him off with a prescription and say, look, I just want you to take 2 strips of duct tape, toe and heel. I want you to test it on the outside of this right boot for a run, peel it off, test without, and again, same deal. We would hope for timing video and input from a coach or a trainer on the hill. But so like in your case, it's a necessity. I've got some athletes who, for lack of a better way to explain this, and I'm reaching here to come up with facts, but there's a pretty good chance that a lot of the smaller European countries can come up with decisions about saying every boot should be 0 on the lower and a half out or 1 out at the cuff, because they're never dealing with any oddities. And why do I say that? Because if you're in the Austrian system, your best athletes in your country are pushed towards the sport of ski racing. They're not being pushed towards soccer. They're not being, towards tennis or swimming. And so when you raise that way, guess who rises to the top of the podium right away? Age 12, 13, 11. It's the ones that have actually really good alignment, really good, they fit into the boot out of the box and they've got great alignment. We did this deal a long time ago at Solomon when I first started working for them in the 80s, where they used to have junior Olympics across the country, and we had a guy go to each junior Olympics and take the top 10 kids off the podium and check their alignment. And guess what we found in the US at that level?
All over the place, probably.
Yeah. And so the reason why is because there's a pretty good chance that Johnny and Susie got plucked out of the school system for basketball, baseball, football, swimming, track, tennis, golf. I mean, if you think about it, there's 330 million people in our country, and there's only 1 million active skiers in the United States. So, so our pool, if you will, may be the same size pool as skiers in other countries, but if that's a sport that's honored and preserved and pushed up, then you're clearly going to have athletes that need less work. Exceptions might be, if anybody remembers Herman Meyer's crash, on the motorcycle,
Yeah.
where he pretty much had his whole
one leg was totally different size. than the other
rebuilt.
one.
I can absolutely guarantee you that at that point,
They changed it for sure.
yeah, they had to take some special care with Meyer just to get him back on the hill.
Or like Dane Spencer as well. Like when he had his crash, his one leg was way shorter than the other leg all of a sudden, and he had to change.
Well, and that's probably one of the reasons why Dane is like, he's into it, right?
Yeah.
He's like doing boot work,
Yeah.
and he's like, he loves that. But the problem I'm saying we kind of have a little bit in the U.S. is we have to do some fixing sometimes. So, when I get Lila Lapagna on here, and she's got one leg that's just like 2 degrees outside, there's,
naturally.
I just have to do something. And now that she broke her leg 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, we've had to make another adjustment. So, but Lila wouldn't still be ski racing at age 27 if those changes hadn't been made and recognized when she was 13, 14 years old, when she first started coming in. And Travis, I'm pretty sure, because he used to be on Technica boots, and we probably started working together early on before you even made the team, was standing perfectly as an athlete. Travis didn't struggle to get to the top of the podium when he was a J3 or a J4. So
I'm curious about, we're talking about the bottom of the boot, canting, grinding, but what about the inside of the boot on the sole and the boot board together? That can create a lot of...
So we were chatting about that earlier before you got here. We were just more or less talking about the ramp angle. So for me, it was always 12 millimeters in the front, 22 in the back, making sure it's flat, making sure it doesn't move.
And flat side to side, right?
Yeah.
So there's no varus or valgus of the boot board inside.
Like, so when you're in there, it's just locked in, and when you do rotate inside the boot, it goes straight to the edge of the ski. It doesn't. There's no like wiggle room or play or anything. It just locks right in there.
And then you have to worry about the sole, the interior sole of the boot.
No.
Have any effect?
Not really. I mean, the interior of the boot has the inverse of this, so it just fits in and it doesn't move.
Okay. That's true. Yeah.
So that doesn't really change much. You do have to worry about obviously walking on pavement or dirt or rocks,
Even on snow for that matter.
snow, and the boot board, or the, what do you call these, the
lift plates,
lifters getting all worn out and changing, and
which by the way, it's at their level, it's not unusual for them, a couple times during the season to get things rechecked, right?
Yeah.
Especially, again, if you've got an inkling in your head, if you're on the flats and you're in your tuck and you're just feeling something a little weird, the first thing you'd probably do is just do a quick alignment check, just to see if the lifter's worn or
wore out the heel or something and it's kind of moving. I mean, I was the worst with that. I never traveled with
cat tracks.
And they were just a pain to I don't know. I used to call it natural canting. I would just walk everywhere all season, and just that's my natural way of walking. But walking is not skiing. Skiing is totally different. So
but if you go to a training session or you go to a race and watch the guys or the girls, they pretty much get out of their boots as soon as they're just hanging out, and they go into a bag. So you're not typically doing the long walk through town in Kitzbühel to your hotel in your ski boots, right?
No.
So,
I mean, from the bottom of Val Gardena to the gondola, you have to walk through this thick of gravel,
right?
And that's the worst for grinding on the boots.
But I do want to, because you asked the question, and this is somewhat of an important point. There's a lot of things going on. Just the basics of the foot. There's 26 bones in the foot. That's a quarter. There's 25% of the bones in your whole body are in your feet. It's actually an amazing contraption. How many joints there are, and how many bones there are, and how many tendons, ligaments, and all that stuff is in here. But the ultimate goal, and this comes again to athletes who have naturally good bodies for ski racing. They typically don't have foot alignment issues, like where these little small cubey bones in the middle of the foot, called the midfoot bones, don't collapse or don't rock and roll. But when you start to add angle between the bottom of the foot and the top of the ski, or the top of the boot board, or whatever you're measuring off of, that's when you get into trouble with the bones in the foot. You never want to compromise. For every one of these joints that's in here, they all need a certain amount of balance, if you will, or spacing between the joints. And if certain joints get either pushed out of place or locked, then the foot doesn't behave properly and you don't have the ability to steer the ski the way that Travis is talking about, to be able to control it. And so I've seen shops, or I've seen places where they don't do this kind of work with an outsole and canting and even cuff canting, and they will put canted material on the boot board, which it's really problematic if you can't see the person's foot when you start to alter how the foot sits. Now, there's some arguments that certain athletes do some of that to try and get the foot to actually splay and to work towards the inside. And from that, you know, people who watch from the outside looking in can see things like Bodie was a great example. Bodie has just this huge navicular and ankle complex here that probably came from just running hard for years. You get bone spurs built up, but his boots needed all to accommodate that, so his foot kind of just sat down in it properly, and that little bump they used to put in there, they started calling it the Bodie bump. But then athletes started going, oh, well, Bodie's got a bump, I should have a bump. And you know, and if your foot didn't need it, then the bump isn't actually bringing you into the same party that Bodie's playing in. He had to do that to have his balance and to have his feet work well for what he was doing. But for everybody else, I'm going to say that's the exception to the rule, and that you don't want to be messing at all with this structure. So can we transition to your footbed? Just talk about why you have one and what it does.
I think the last thing I'll mention though is like, when you put on a boot and you walk around a store, boots are not made for walking, right? And oftentimes I think it's just a kind of a joke. Like, people buy a pair of boots because it feels good walking around in a store. And that, I mean, there's one thing that says like when you're in a boot in a store, like the comfort's one thing, but they're not really meant for walking. They're meant for skiing. So, side note, anyway.
Yeah, but to that point, what people look for when they're doing that walk around is that there's no pain and everything's comfortable. Yeah. But Travis can also tell you about times when he's done work and then realized after he did the work that he did too much.
Yeah, and once you do too much, it's really, really hard to
come home.
I mean, we've tried to like heat up a toe and get it to come back in. Yep. I mean, the liners are one way to kind of try to fill it up too. But
if you don't have if you don't have the encasement the same or similar when those foam injected liners go in, then you don't have a love match, and then it doesn't seem to work out right.
You were saying like better athletes from Austria or smaller countries in Europe tend to have more symmetry and fit the kind of ideal mold of.
Well, just simply that it's not because they have that. It's
but like
it's because they have that.
There tends to be a correlation.
Absolutely, there's absolutely.
Do you think that correlation creates a better skier in a non-trivial way?
I mean, when I was a kid, first on Atomic and going to the factory, like they were telling me like, this is the boot, this is how it's set up, this is how it works, because that's like and then everybody goes into a stock boot pretty much, and they don't have to do that much work. And I was looking at my foot from years of Technica boots, and they were just mangled, and I don't know. I felt weird. I was like, well, I think I should like look at this a little bit and try to figure out what works for me. And it's just a little different mindset, I guess, is what I learned. I don't know.
So I'm not sure, because there isn't statistical data. I can give you statistical data about kids that are at this level by this age, that those are the ones that, you know, like if you like start to count the people that have won junior world championships and that ended up, you know, winning a World Cup Globe, there's like, you could ring the bell on it. But there's also plenty of stories of people that come from outside that perfect circle and have to fight their way in. And, you know, I think in some cases we end up losing kids earlier than we should because those things don't get recognized. And I think that's actually, if I was to look at other federations, the way it comes together is that we, I think, retire way more athletes between U14 and U16 than I think any other country in the world, because if these things don't get identified and you're not starting to show success by U16, other than the fact that skiing is like the most fun you can have almost for free in the world, it's easy to see why kids would get frustrated at age 15 if they're not making the jump to the front half of the field, right? And so then we lose athletes, and I think that may be the mitigating factor, is that those athletes in these other countries, if they're still skiing well and they've got good, you know, physiology, then not so much of a problem. But here, if we don't recognize that, like for example, with Lila, if someone hadn't recognized her need for alignment when she was young, I guarantee you she would have been in college a long time ago, would have been retired, and not still at the sport. So
I mean, in here there's also a lot less shops and a lot less people that that know what to look for and know how to adjust that compared to those small European countries where skiing is like part of their culture, like it's different. It's just different, you know. It's hard to go into a random ski shop in a random city here and talk about these things because you probably won't really get a great response from the shop.
There's
Right.
like here in like Mount Hood, right? Or
Yeah, I mean,
pretty
there's-
much,
there's
bottles
little-
and
yeah.
up there,
Yeah,
and
you'll find a Start Haus and a gym in most
ski
ski
communities.
communities.
Yeah.
Maybe more than one.
Yeah.
And in some cases,
and
like
they really know that equipment matters.
Yeah.
And it matters at this level, and it matters at this level earlier than we tend to think about.
and it's getting to the point where there's like academies and programs that involve, you know, education, that they're hiring their own people. Like Vail has this amazing, ski prep deal, and for a while they had an actual boot guy on staff, so that every group, every kid in the program went through it. They've now kind of changed their philosophy, and they're using some local ski shops. But there's now some better local ski shops in Colorado than there were 10 years ago.
Yeah, the same paradigm is kind of happening in climbing, where the U.S. is, on competition level, is way behind, and we're kind of starting to figure out, like, oh, this is actually a real thing.
Yeah. There's all these little details that you can pay way more attention to that'll help. No matter how old you are in the sport. Yeah.
But I do want to go back to what I said earlier, though, and that is that the goal is a flat baseline. It's not like we're trying to reinvent the sport, reinvent ski boots, we're not going to discover something that we do that just blows the world away, but we just want to make sure that everybody's on this level playing field and we're doing the best we can with what shows up in front of us.
Yeah, because if there's something that's super wonky with your setup, it's going to really relate to your skiing in a negative way. But if you're aligned,
Well, and to that point, there's some really good coaches in the room here. A lot of times, the way our teaching system and coaching system works is that in many cases it's skill-based kind of way of coaching, and maybe more so in ski teaching, where ski instructors are shown the tools they need to get people to be able to turn their skis this way and go over here, and turn their skis this way and go over there. But the bottom line is like, for a ski instructor that keeps a spiral notebook that's got all of the drills in it that they learned, they can get through the whole end of the list, right, with an athlete that's doing something weird. Don't know why they do this, but we got to fix this. And we've tried everything, rubber band on the arm, and all they do is fall over. And we've tried this, we've tried that. And in the end, sometimes those problems, they start at the snow, and they start at the person's ability to actually just get the feet turned up and rolled to get the edge engaged. And yet here are these coaches and these instructors that eventually reach a point, and I hate to say this out loud because I still consider myself to be a coach and an instructor, but we give up and we just say, God, that's the dumbest kid I've ever worked with. Or, that woman couldn't buy a turn if I gave her $1 million. But the point of it is a lot of times, if all that gets done on the front side, and imagine how hard it is in outside of ski racing, but in recreational skiing, to start late in life, go into the rental shop, and have somebody put you in a pair of boots and a pair of skis, and then send you out for your first lesson. There's probably a pretty good reason why it's such a hard sport to learn.
Yeah, I mean, talk about growing the sport with like never-evers that come into it, and they get in a random boot and they try to go ski, and it's 2 sizes too big, and they're just swimming around and they're flailing like that. Yeah. That's not if people were fit properly for their first time out, and they're nice and athletic, balanced position on their skis, and they could actually like work on the technical part. It would be game changing for the whole sport,
And it would change ski instructors and ski coaches' approach to things, because they would stop just repeating the same thing over and over again. Stand on your outside ski. Stand on your outside ski. You got more weight on your outside ski. Get on your outside ski. At some point, to any 13-year-old, 12-year-old kid, that's like wah 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 wah, and it's gone. But the answer might be somewhere else. It might be in how the ski is prepped. It might be in the fact that the boot's either too small or too big, or it's not an appropriate flex, or it's not aligned properly. So that's why on the front side, we want to eliminate all those variables, and whether it's a recreational skier or a World Cup skier, it's same principles.
I mean, my whole career, I never got to a point where I was like content with my boot. I was always trying to make sure it was like perfect, and every once in a while, like I would get in a boot that just fit really well. Like in 2014 in Kitzbühel, I cracked my boot before Kitzbühel, and I got a brand new boot that week. I trained one day in Hinterite, and then I went into the race and raced on it because my own cracked. I had no choice, and I was like 4th in the Super G and 6th in the downhill. And then I went to Sochi and I was 5th in the Olympics, and then I had my first podium. And then I had, I think the next 15 races I was like top 10 more or less. And then I cracked that boot. And then that boot was done, and then I got on a new boot, and it was like back to the drawing board, like trying to get it back up to snuff to where that race boot was. But for some reason that one just worked. And it was devastating. When it cracked, I tried to put like a rivet here and like put it all back together, but the power was just gone. There was no more power. So
in a boot, do you ever have a boot that's like, yeah, everything feels good? Or are you usually like, oh, this little thing over on my ankle could be a little bit better, or this thing under my toe could be a little bit better? Or is there like always something that you're thinking about like that?
no, it's like for me personally, when I would find my race boot, I would have pain like getting in and out of it, but once I was in it, it would just be like locked in.
Yeah.
I wouldn't feel any issues. I would feel comfortable. Like my body would be able to move freely. Like it fit really well. But to get to that point, that's kind of why I always started with so many pairs of boots in the spring, because I would always be kind of fine tuning, and then once I got that boot, I would kind of put it to the side and work on a backup boot. And start trying to get that backup boot to get to that same place as like my race boot for comfort and fit and performance. Because then by the time that one cracked, I would have a new one, you know?
Yeah, you were talking about always trying to improve your boot, but I'm kind of like, what are you looking for? If you're like, this boot feels really good, and you're like, all right, then how do we improve it?
I mean, yeah, it's a good question. I think boot technology hasn't really changed in a long time, right? As far as like the simple nuts and bolts of it.
If anything, it's gotten simpler because more companies are copying other existing.
Maybe less innovation.
Yeah.
So honestly, I think it always comes down to the fit, and because if this boot was a tiny bit too big, it would be comfortable, but then it would also not perform. So it's like it always comes down to that fine line of getting the fit just right, and it's also, I mean, a big part of it for me was my liner. I would always have like a stock liner or a foam liner, and they would work for, I don't know, 10, 15 days. And then all of a sudden, like, they would kind of be broken in and the fit would change of the boot. And so that's kind of why I gravitated towards these custom liners that had a little bit stiffer foam. And I mean, these are 4 years old now, they're falling apart, but I still, if I was racing today, I would still use them. I mean, they're just so dialed with the way that they fit in the boot. Yeah. Do you want to talk about liners at all, or beds, or
let's you got a liner in your hand. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
So Travis's approach isn't universal. Not everybody uses custom liners, but quite a few athletes do, and they can be of different types. They can be foam injected. They can be stock liners from the factory that they tend to go through quite a few of them because there's not a lot of in them in their materials that kind of break down. There are custom tongues that are made by specialists. Like in Switzerland, there's a guy that all he makes is tongues, and the importance of holding the foot, down and back into the boot through the tongue is probably one of the critical aspects that most boot fitters don't even talk about that. They're always concerned about the length of the thing. But if you've got the tongue set up and the pressure over the top of the foot set up properly, and just good buckle pressure locks everything in, it can take your toe off the front of the boot as an example.
Yeah.
So
I mean, the tongue is a really interesting topic, because I was really picky with my tongues and my liners, and I would always set them up super far back so they would come super high, so I could actually like really wrench down on my booster strap and almost have a third,
like a lever higher up the leg.
Lever up the leg, and then but then there's other people that put it way far forward and pushed it way down, and it was barely even like, but then that maybe adds more pressure down here. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to kind of fine tune.
But I think the key thing, when you get to Travis's level, and this is what young kids don't understand yet, is the importance of dialing that feeling in, of being right where you need to be. And so, just your description of how you pull it up and you use the booster strap up high, that's a key deal where other people won't like that kind of pressure. And or in speed, maybe you'd see people don't want that influence from the leg, whereas in slalom and GS, or slalom specifically, you see boots are definitely taller and more instant on-off, so that as soon as you move forward, you get that pressure onto the ski. But the point of it is, though, is that at that level, you did through your own discovery without having to do actual time tests, just based off of feel.
It's all feel. Yeah, no, because I could make one turn and I would know instantly what it felt like and if it was going to work or not.
And I can tell you, as a guy who used to sit on the hill with a timer and athletes, that there's certain things that you can test and you can have facts based, tell you what's going on. And specifically that sole canting, cuff canting, and the ramp angle, those are all things that are identifiable by time and video. Pressure on the front of the leg, they're really,
measure. There are people out there trying to figure out how to measure that.
Did you ever hook up with the dude in Reno that had that little, there was a guy in Reno, he's kind of an inventor guy that came up with this little air-filled tube, went to a pressure sensing device that was up above the boot, and before you got in, you'd fill the tube up with air, and then the mechanics or the technology of it was essentially wires that came up from there into headphones, and it would beep when you had pressure on the front of your leg. So the idea was, it could tell you, but when you start to realize that those kind of things, like when you're at that level, he doesn't need a beeper to tell him that he's not on the front of the boot. And likewise now, there's this latest technology I've seen is these carve units that go under the foot that have sensors underneath. And I think Ted's actually involved with them now. And they're trying to develop it, I think, further because up until the time Ted got involved, I think it was just kind of languishing and not really much happening. But I'm still not sure that it's something that's going to be beneficial, and measurable to how fast you go down the hill. Yeah. It could, potentially describe when you're getting rolled up on edge, when you're getting pressure. But I'm not sure, again, that you're going to want either something talking in your ear or, walking you down the hill as you're doing it. But so those technologies exist, but like I said, I think you nailed it when you said, I do this, and you just go, yeah, he does that because he's looking for that feeling. Good, yeah. He's just looking for that feeling of just knowing that when I do this, I get this result, and that's what I'm looking for.
Well, it comes back to consistency as well. Like I always buckle my buckles at the same level. Like I buckle them in a certain order so that the fit and everything is exactly the same every time. And then I know when I push on the ski what's going to happen instead of like having a question mark in my head or if something feels a little weird.
But I also do want to say that that stuff's real and you can feel it. It's not the same as either always racing in the same socks or wearing the same underwear, or and
those are superstitions.
Yeah, but some athletes kind of approach their deal like that. But the stuff we're talking about here is something that an athlete at that level has the proprioception to be able to tell the difference between when it's working and when it's not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about your footbeds? And, and what those bring to the table for you?
Yeah, I mean the footbed, it's kind of a personal preference thing. I don't know. I think every athlete has a different footbed that they like or they don't like. Or for me, it was all about just getting my heel locked in. So these footbeds are super thin in the heel. They were kind of built up around the back, and I also would grind out the heel of my boot to the point where when I got in there, it would really come back and then just be stuck in the back. But then I figured out over the years that I really liked movement in the rest of my foot. And so we took out all the material in the front here so that when I'm in the boot, I can kind of press down into the boot. And so like locking in the heel, but then being able to move still and being athletic inside of the boot. And so that was something for me that's slightly different than a lot of other athletes. A lot of other athletes have these big built up footbeds that are kind of flat, just an extension from the boot board. But my preference, and this is what really, this comes back to the feeling. Like I could feel so much more power and so much more dynamic skiing if I could kind of have that little inside move pressure inside the boot.
And if you go to a place where they only make one kind of footbed, that's what you get. And you could do that, just build one kind of footbed, but you need to have somebody sitting in front of you like Travis is saying, okay, it feels okay, but I don't have the freedom I want to feel right when I kind of go from the heel kind of forward. I want to be able to just kind of have it flex and roll in. Can you help me with that? And then I could flip the thing over, go to the grinder, and let's say I posted it all the way up and I removed that posting and you went out and skied on it, you go, oh, that was it. You
And this is
nailed it.
all just trial and error, honestly.
And I also want to throw out there, and it's fun now to do this in 2023, but as long as I've been around in this business, I've heard nothing but like this quote, Europeans don't use footbeds. And I just want to tell you straight up, it's not true. There's some that don't, but there's also some American athletes that don't use footbeds. They just use the stock liner, or they use nothing. But the ultimate goal, let me have the footbed, and this isn't for the right foot, it's on the opposite side, but the idea of what Travis is talking about is this cupped heel, if you imagine that this is what the heel bone looks like, sits in that so that it doesn't do this rock and roll deal, which if you look at the midfoot bones, if this, the talus here, which is what this big bone is called, twists, it locks and unlocks these midfoot bones and joints, which collapse the foot, make the foot extend in length, makes the pinky toe reach towards the outside of the boot, and it basically usurps the power, if you will, of a foot that's standing up nice and tall and can actually drive the boot. And so the things that he feels and he's looking for, he's describing them well, but he's not describing them specifically to how a footbed helps him. And the footbed helps him because it keeps his heel bone from locking and unlocking. This point about where it sits in here and where the arch shape ends. So this point where the big toe is in the middle of the heel, when this is set deep into his boot because he's made a pocket for it, and the foot sits on it, the foot doesn't want to move forward. If it doesn't have these shapes and these things that help control the movement of the foot fore aft, you can constantly be trying to readjust your balance position all the way up to the hips if this device isn't properly set into the liner and he doesn't have this part of this dropped deep into the back of the boot. So it's not about whether footbeds are necessary or not necessary to win. It's about simply having one that does the basics that you need, which is to just lock, or using the word lock is bad because it gives the perception that you can't have movement, but it helps to hold the heel bone, vertical, which keeps the Achilles tendon pointed up towards the sky. And as long as this stays stable, it allows this part of the foot to work properly for what you're trying to get it to do.
Awesome. Yeah.
And it improves the fit because if all that stuff is there and the heel bone's back here and his big toe comes to the end, his toe problems that he was talking about being short get mitigated because they stop and they don't keep going forward. Every time he gets in the back seat, his foot doesn't shift forward. I can't tell you how many watching young kids, you just know they're in boots that are too big because you can see how their knee gets behind where their heel is because the boot's so big. It allows, when the pressure's on the calf, it allows the foot to move forward, anywhere from an eighth to half an inch in the boot. And that can't be easy for a kid who's trying to learn the sport and learn how to go fast to be constantly having to find, how he gets his hips back over his feet for balance.
Yeah, we coach down at the American Downhiller camps every spring, and it's like so evident when you ski around with your group and you see like how big all their boots are and how they're struggling to do what we're trying to have them do, and then you add in downhill and super G and going up jumps and speeds, and it's just like kind of gets chaotic a little bit. But if all that attention was given at the front end, like what Jim was saying, to the setup and the fit and all these little pieces that make it a lot easier to ski, it would totally change the game.
So I don't coach full time because I've been running a business, but I do coach a lot of camps, and with each one of my groups before I start a camp, the very first thing I do with the kids is I get them in the hotel or at the bottom before we go up the hill, and I just do a quick shell check. I just have them take their boot off, take the liner out, I slide them in the shell, I got my flashlight in my pocket, and I look down in there and see how much room they've got, and I just kind of do a quick assessment, looking at the athlete, looking at the size of the foot, size of the boot, and we might make an adjustment on day one before we even go up on the hill if it looks obvious that we're struggling with somebody like that. Yeah. And Phil, you're dipping into this coaches training deal now. I've started doing these training things with coaches on boots. And I did 5 groups at Squaw a couple weeks ago. of where, you know, we sat down and talked about, all right, so what are you looking for? How do you identify, you know, talent? And how do you, you know, kind of make the connection between the equipment and the talent to allow you to be the best coach you can be, by making sure that you've eliminated that variable that could be a little bit loosey-goosey. And I can tell you it's really hard. It's not just the kid showing up at the boots. How did the kid get the boots? Who paid for them?
Yeah, the parent.
And where were they standing when the boots were done? Like hovering right over the shoulder of the boot fitter, and they say things like room to grow, and you're like, you got to be kidding me. You know, the kid measures 25.5. We're going to put him in a 25.5, and you know, when he gets to go to the next size is when the device of measuring says he's a 26, not before, not after. And you don't just say, oh, I don't want to buy boots next year, or things like, I know Billy's going to grow this year because I know everything about kids. He's my kid. I know he's going to grow next year, so we have to get a bigger boot today for his growth tomorrow. And as a like a lover of the sport and a coach, I'm pretty good at looking the parent in the eye and just saying, we're not going to do this here. But if you're a 20-year-old that's come here to work for your first season and you don't have like the confidence to look at a mom and dad who's got a, you know, like a metal gold card and or a black card that's made out of metal, and you know, you can't expect them to do that. So we have a process in the shop where there's certain lines that we won't cross over. You know, if a kid measures, you know, a 23, they don't get a 26. They get, you know, then you start with the 23 and see where that goes.
Yeah.
Okay, is there?
I think we've covered a lot. Yeah, do you have any other final?
I'm not that.
All right, and so yeah, I'll open up for questions now. Do you guys have any more questions?
So with boot boards, what is the stock angle of the boot board?
Most of them come, and it's not universal, but they're somewhere usually around 24-12. I would say is average, but
So that's the same as he uses. Right?
So mine are
12,
22 in the
Oh,
back.
yeah, but
So-
it means his been dropped 2 millimeters to
Okay,
get to 22.
So 12, 22.
But if he shipped it from the factory without any grind, it would have been 24-12. But here's just kind of an interesting. I'm not a very good at math, but I understand certain principles, and the principle is this: that if a size 22 or 23 woman's boot has a 24-12, and Travis's 25 has a 24-12, and I wear a 27, and my boot board's a 24-12, which one's got the most forward lean, the most angle?
The smallest one.
The smallest one.
Yeah.
So there's kind of this innate deal that is a difference between the size of the boots that I don't think, if you were to walk into a ski shop with that and ask just a boot fitter that sells boots, you would spin them out so badly they would have no idea what you're talking about or why.
Yeah.
But my point is that these numbers are kind of only relative, and that's what's so funny about the Euros having this idea that they all have to be like this, because they're not taking into consideration at the factory the difference between, like, so Perry's boots, she's got an elevated heel, according to the world, because she's in a 23 shell.
Didn't you say that he shifted to those numbers? Everybody should use those numbers.
Well, it's
In the beginning, 12.
yeah,
22.
but they're your numbers.
Oh.
So
okay.
when I say
it's
when I say everybody should use those numbers, is if we had the whole team here right now and I just asked every single athlete what your numbers, they would all know it. It's not in their phone written down on a note. Is
that something that you fit skier with, or is it something that he just felt that's the best?
If at his level, he's developed that. At this level, like if I'm selling a boot, there's two reasons why I might change the elevation of the boot board, and that has to do with the natural ankle ability to function in something called dorsiflexion, your ability to pull the toes up, or in a sense flex. But dorsiflexion means to bring the dorsal, or the top, like a fish, part of your foot up towards your knee. And if you have, was your lower leg break or your knee?
Yeah, lower leg.
Do you have limitations in the flex of your ankle on the left?
I know there was a bit of ankle stuff.
Like when you were doing PT and stuff, were they working on
We
trying
worked on it a lot, so it was pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's maybe more typical with injury, and it can be asymmetrical, but there can be just certain humans that have limited range of motion or have excessive range of motion in their ankle. And the boot board height and the forward lean of the spoiler is how you adapt that. And I don't want to spin you guys out, but I'm gonna just show you a little math formula.
Well, and also the ramp angle too. Phil, you might be able to help with this. So that when the ramp angle is, when the heel's down and the toe's higher, your ankle's more cocked, right?
And
so that's maybe more aggressive. And then if the heel's high and the toe's low, you're more upright. And so that can change.
And that's actually the most important point to this. It's not the 24-12 or the 22-12. It's putting an angle meter on it.
It's the angle. So
and saying that's a 5, that's a 4, that's a 3 in degrees.
Oh, the difference.
And so let me just give you this example, and if you can call me off if I'm blowing anybody's mind here, but if you were to imagine,
is there any ramp on the interior of the boot below the boot board?
Typically not. So typically that like this
should be level.
Should be flat.
Yeah, so this deal here and this deal here should start level on the bottom of that boot, so it's not cocked up or not cocked up this way. But if we were to imagine for a sec, you have to excuse my ability to draw, or lack of ability to draw. Okay, so if you imagine that this has a boot board in it, comes stock, and it's higher to lower, so it's at an angle here. And this boot has a forward lean that's, let's say, I'm just going to use raw numbers, but let's just say this is 15 degrees from 0 is how the forward lean of the spoiler goes. And this deal here is, let's just say on an average, these are usually around somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees. What you would do to figure out what the net forward lean of this boot is simply take that number, subtract it from this number, and 15 minus 4 is 11. So this boot we're looking at here and this boot board has a net forward lean of 11 degrees. So why that's important is that we can actually measure the amount of dorsiflexion that a human has. So that's another scientific approach that I can position myself or anybody who I'm working with by getting into this semi-weighted position, lower leg at 90, foot at 90 to the lower leg, thigh at 90 to the lower leg, thigh to the back 90 degrees. So you've got 90, 90, and 90 down there. And if I just simply, in this position, if the person sitting in front of me held my heel bone down and said, raise your foot up, I could take my fingers and slide it underneath where my pinky toe or the head of my pinky toe is, and depending on how much room there is there, it tells me how much dorsiflexion someone has. And you can actually use an angle meter. You could put it on a board, like a flat, like a clear piece of Lexan or something, and go like that, put the angle meter on the board, and the angle meter will tell you that this ankle is moving 10 degrees to 18 degrees if it's normal. So we know what normal dorsiflexion is, between 10 and 18. So what's the number right there? 11. Help me with math. Is that between 10 and 18? All right, so normal ankle gets normal boot board. It's that simple. So is there a range in there? Yeah, you could test up, you could test down, but you'd want to keep it. If the ankle range of motion is normal, then you would have a boot board that's in that range that Travis has in his boot. If someone is really tight, like in my case, I broke my calcaneus at some point, and the way I healed didn't really allow for me to have normal dorsiflexion because the bone material kind of went right through the Achilles tendon above my heel bone. And so what I have to do, because I can only move my foot about 6 degrees, how do I get 6 degrees out of this boot? What do I have to do?
Increase the forward lean.
So reverse that, because I got to get this number to come down.
Or raise the heel up.
Or raise the heel up. So those are the two things, and sometimes you have to do both. But so guess what I get in all of my boots? I'm on the high side of Travis's number. I got like 24 or 25 because I have to raise this angle so it's steeper. So now it's, let's say this one's 5 degrees instead of 4. And here if I can either straighten this up a little bit or do something on the front side of it to push the leg back, which I tend to do both. I put like a wedge into here.
In the tongue? Or
Yeah,
or
into the tongue.
shelf?
Yeah, on the tongue.
Yeah, on the
And-
tongue of the liner.
Yeah, tongue of the liner.
Yeah.
And then I take my power strap and I pull it tight to pull my leg up. So I get this 15 to go to 11. All right, so now 11 minus 5 is, it matches.
That's what you have. That's
yeah.
your exact number.
Yep. And unfortunately, and I don't know how to explain this either with facts, but we always do everything bilaterally. So even though I only got one bad ankle, this one functions somewhat normally. Both boots get the same treatment. So I'm skiing, 11 and 5
So you're standing in the same way.
in both boots, right? So I'm not somehow got some weird deal going where this one's up and this one's down or something like that. And the inverse of that, and so, but more important than this, right? Because now I threw math into the whole deal and
We're skiing still, right?
yeah, exactly. We're still talking about skiing.
Yeah.
What happens on the hill when the ankle doesn't move? What do you see? What's the athlete feel?
Can't engage the tip of the ski or the
They're back.
ski.
Yeah, you get stuck in a position which you can't work your way out of, and so that takes into account a whole nother deal. So this ankle only moves a little bit, so on my boots I should get really soft boots, right?
No.
Okay, so why, Mitch? Why shouldn't I get a soft boot?
Well, there's many reasons, but like depends on the situation.
So the main one is because my dorsiflexion only goes so far, and if the boot is soft,
You're gonna be maxing out that too much.
or I get to the point where it goes as far as it can go, and I haven't powered up the ski, I haven't delivered the message from my leg to the ski, and so I've got to bring the boot back to my leg, and I need something stiff here to push against, so that when I send the message, it goes right away and I get good response. So, and that's just like what you might see on the hill. What might you see with fit if the ankle stops? Where's the boot going to hurt?
Top of the foot.
So it could be the top of the foot. But how about the calcaneus, the heel bone? Because if I can only go to here, and I'm going 60, I'm going 60 miles an hour, and I'm trying to turn, and I'm here, what's it want to do to the foot? It wants to lever it up,
Yeah, it's just grinding up.
and when it levers it up, this part of the heel bone is going to want to bang. That nice pocket that he's got in here that he made for his. Your heel bone's going to go boom, 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 like that all day while you're skiing, and in the end, you're going to have these heel spurs that look like Bryce Bennett's, which are, I don't know, what do you think Bryce's heel bump is about that?
Yeah,
Fat off the back of
pretty
his size 15 foot. So there's pain and fit related to these problems as well. The one to me though that's the most perplexing is when you get kids that are hypermobile, and what do you think you'll identify on the hill when you see someone who can push the boot all the way down, almost like the telemark scheme? What will show on the hill? What's really difficult for that athlete?
Catch an edge, to hold an edge.
Not so much edging, but as far as fore-aft balance, they can't get back to home base. Or what might you see in their body that helps keep them there? Might they sway their back a bit? Might they bend over at the waist? They're trying to pull all sorts of pieces out. And it's a funky deal. And again, it's one of those deals where technically you can tell a kid, settle down. Don't don't use all the junk you got. Just get everything quiet in here and just use your ankles, use your feet. But then yet somehow they still end up using everything they got to try and bring the hips back over the feet as they complete each turn and start the next turn. And it's really difficult for them. And so for them, you do the exact opposite. You actually lower this. So let's say 10 to 18 is normal. So let's say you got a kid who's got 20 degrees of dorsiflexion, and they're struggling because no two turns start and finish the same way for that athlete, because they're always like trying to readjust and find the position. So at 20, what do I have to do? I got to get this thing pretty flat. So I might get down on this boot board, I might drop it 2 or 3 millimeters, and instead of being a 4, let's see if I can get it to 2 degrees. And then up here, I will actually increase the forward lean. And so what are some ways you can do that in a boot today? Let's, yeah, you have yours riveted in. Do you have spoiler? No? spoilers.
I don't have spoilers on my liner, but the spoiler on the top of the boot will help kind of push you forward.
Increase the forward lean. But so you want to increase the forward lean on this now. See if I can't get this boot to have, instead of 15, let's see if we can get it to 20. 20 minus 2 is 18. I'm now kind of at the bottom end of the window, and maybe I have to go a little bit more. So, again, I could add a wedge back here. And back to that same question, they've got a ton of movement, so I should put them in a soft boot, right? So they can use the whole range of motion?
Again, no.
Right, go the exact reverse of that, which once again, I want this part to be hard, and so if I had, like a kid had a choice between a 70 flex boot and a 90, you'd kind of say, all right, let's go to 90 flex, and that will help hold them up straighter. What can that athlete do when you hold them up straighter and you get response right away? What will they do? Instead of being...
Their body will settle down?
They'll settle down. They'll just, right here. I got everything going, but I can drop my hips a bit, little pressure, ankles rolled in, pressure to the front of the boot, and all of a sudden I'm standing tall and able to manipulate the ski without having to do any fancy gymnastics. So that's where the boot board comes in. And so, but at the World Cup level, I would say that that's not the typical deal. No one's sitting there with World Cup athletes.
I've never measured any of that stuff.
Right.
In my
well,
book, but
you haven't, but I have.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And guess what we know about Travis? I'll just say it straight up. He's been on a podium in a World Cup. So what do we know about his ankle dorsiflexion?
I'm probably in the zone.
He's right. You are the zone. Just like every European athlete that made it through, the U system to the national team, to win a junior world championship, to be on a World Cup podium. They just have what it takes, which is a normal ankle that flexes between 10 and 18. So,
just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that when we do all these adjustments to the boot, the foot, the natural mechanics of the bones and how they align, you kind of throw it out of whack. You could, when you do too many adjustments. I was just wondering if anybody experimented like with zero dog, like they have with shoes, where you don't put any boot ramp angle, but you just do natural.
No, and I would say there's two things I should bring up here, because there's one, it's not very typical to have a flat boot board, but it's also not very typical to have the ramp angle off the ski reversed. And I think that's something that got misconstrued somewhere in there when people talked about gas pedaling and raising and elevating the toe of the boot. And I'm not saying it's never done, but it's not the norm. That every binding that you get from every binding manufacturer still has a higher heel than a higher toe. And they mitigate that typically by using 1 or 2 millimeter shims to level that out. But it's pretty rare to take the toe up above the heel. And why it's important is that none of these things that we do, you want to force the bones to comply, because you want to force the bones to comply. So this whole idea behind getting a number that balances the ankle joint properly is just simply about a check on a list that says we got that dialed in, we don't need to make any accommodation. When I'm working with a recreational skier, it's part of the normal system that we use here to check their ankle dorsiflexion. And if I find they're low on dorsiflexion, before we even try a boot on, to sell them a boot, guess what we put on the boot board? A heel lift to elevate and get them in the target. And or I will lower the boot board, even if the boot's not bought or sold. You make the adjustment, and so that if I'm trying on 2 different boots on a customer, and they have limited range of motion, I'll add the heel lifts to all 4 boots before we try them on. And if they don't buy any of the boots, they walk out of the store, what do I do with the heel lifts?
Take them back out.
I leave them in there because my boot fitters check every foot, every ankle, and every boot. So if that doesn't belong in there, they'll peel it out when they're trying to boot on the customer. So, I don't wrestle with it, I don't slow down, I don't get into the whole deal of explaining it, I just simply go right to the target so that I get it right the moment they try the boot on. Okay, Anything else that?
I mean, I think we're pretty
Covered
close.
it.
I think we covered a lot. Yeah. Unless you guys have any more questions. Yeah.
Great job.
Yeah.
And
It's really refined when you're talking these angles and stuff, right? Like the ballpark numbers that Jim was talking about in terms of ramp angle stuff. What Travis said earlier, flat is far more important.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you would be shocked how many boots come warped.
Yeah, twisted.
I mean,
Totally.
I mean, just like it's really
And
staggering how that's almost the norm. You can almost count
It's
on
hard
that.
to get a flat boot.
Well,
like when you get a
yeah.
flat boot, that's not the norm. That's like, oh my
Yes.
god, they somehow
So
they
to
figured out.
flatten the sole, make sure that the boot board is flat.
Yeah.
Check check what you have. Like make sure that maybe something wasn't mismanufactured, with the boot board, right? And it just came out of the press weird,
Yeah.
right? But because at Travis's level, right, like we look at bindings. What binding are they on?
Yep.
That particular athlete. What plate are they on and everything. So what's the setup on the ski? Because then we're making the boot in accordance with the ski, right? So you might change.
Yep.
So a certain skier might have more aggressive angle
Setup.
on their setup, their ski setup, binding plate setup. So they would be running a lower heel, not
Oh, yeah.
necessarily because that's the thing for them. It's that they step into that ski setup, which is actually higher than one. Instead of that's not easy. That's something we don't want to change. We want to start playing around with that. There's not a lot of variance you can. We could do it in the boot.
And the other thing, though, to just follow through the point to the end, and Travis mentioned it earlier, but there's only so many runs in a season, and so to test all the stuff, that's actually why some of the stuff gets left undone. So the most important things are right where Phil started, with the boot itself being flat, clean, all of that's there, and the fit has to be right, the alignment has to be right, all of the things, the footbed if you choose to use one, the angle of the boot board, we get all those things done, and in the end, if there's time to then go up on the hill with shims and a screw shooter, and to take a ski that you trust, that's going to be your ski through all of your zero ski, if you will, and then spin the heel, put a 1 mil on, put the heel back on, take a test run, bring it back up, spin the binding off, do it again. To get to that point with an athlete is almost freaking impossible based on just the calendar and the time, and also he's a human being. Like,
Yeah, I can't take a million runs. Yeah.
Right, at some point, you're going to see him crying in the lodge going, I am not an animal. Like they're an experiment that you're working with. And so realistically, so some of those details we don't have the answers to, because getting a company rep, a federation, the coaching staff, the athlete, just to that point.
And having good snow conditions.
Yeah, snow conditions and a sled and all of the
No
pieces
wind.
that have to come into the deal, where you can repeat runs, right behind each other, so the snow doesn't deteriorate, so therefore the times are invalid. So all of these things are really hard, which is why I think you got to stick to the absolute basics.
Yeah. I mean,
Along
the
the way.
baseline setup in when you're not skiing, when you have time, when you can kind of just make sure everything is neutral and where you want it to be to start, then that's almost most of the battle, really. And then once you're up there, a little fine tuning if you have time. But getting to that first stage is something that most skiers don't ever really get to.
And it also depends on the athlete, because I can guarantee you that like the size of Hirscher's crew back in the day, and his ability to get stuff done was different than Travis's ability.
Cool.
If you went to the coaching staff and said, hey guys, today I really need to figure out my heel height on my bindings, can we set up a speed trap, can we
the resources that's a whole nother story, but
and back to what the companies can or can't do. Like if you went to a deal in Sweden or in Norway in the spring when the season was over, and the company puts their energy into it, you could do way more than if your guy is 3 different guys and he's only showing up for a day at a camp.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely no way that your guy could then go to the coaching staff and say, hey guys, I need Travis on the track this morning. He can't, he's not going to train with you, and I need a sled, and I need an assistant coach, and what about radios, and blah, blah, blah. One of the things I wanted to cover off on why race boots, though, in particular are more twisted than recreational boots is because there's so much polyurethane in the sole, the thickness of it, that after it comes out of the mold, if it doesn't sit a little extra time on the mold, or it goes right from the mold to a bin, which they roll them around the factories in these bins on wheels, at that point the thing's not firm jello yet. And so when you've got like 40 shells in a bin, and there's 10 of them are on the bottom and the other 30 are on top of them, the soles as they cure can twist and have pressure on them. The other thing is some of the companies have used this trick. You guys see these little windows in here? These windows were put into these shells to actually allow them to cool quicker, and not all companies do that. So like like these Razzies, for example, you see are all solid. The Langs and the Razzies were probably the worst in terms of twisting. Atomics are solid. They don't do this deal. The only two companies I know that do this are, well, three companies, but two of them are the same. Is Del Bello, Nordica, and Technica all use these reliefs at the toe and at the heel so that they cool faster, and that way it gives them less time to torque or to warp. Okay.
Awesome. Well,
so we'll hang if you guys want to.
Yeah, thank you so much
ask
for
questions.
coming, and I'm gonna host 2 more nights. One in February and one in March. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, and yeah, boots.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Perfect.
I'm like more confused now too.
You want to take a year and go back and try some things?
I mean, yeah. All the things I wish I had known when I was younger, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.